My name is Dr. Scott Stroud. I'm an associate professor of communication studies in the Moody College of Communication and the director of the media ethics program in the Center for Media Engagement. Here's one thing that works for me in teaching my various classes. I often challenge myself to teach our students to be better ethical reasoners. And it's tempting to give them the answers. But ethics isn't about answers. Ethics is not about learning a code of ethics and simply following it. The tough decisions in ethics, in whatever profession you may find yourself in, involve imagination and getting along and resolving problems with others. So one thing that really works for me is using case studies as a way to teach ethical argumentation and moral imagination. Here's how I do it. I find a nicely packaged case study of some controversial issue, say anti-vaccination memes that are humorous, but also that poke fun at vaccination efforts and their role on social media. Now, what should social media do on these things? Many of our students, like many of our professors perhaps, have a certain judgment on these matters, and they say, they should be censored. But half the battle in moral reasoning is figuring out how some people, real or hypothetical, could think the other side of this issue. So in this case, my assignments are structured and my discussions are structured quite simply. I want my students to suspend judgment and to figure out the best arguments or the value positions on either side of this issue. In this case, anti-vaccination memes on social media pit free expression versus public safety interests. Or another case, for instance, doxing and public shaming in the era of COVID-19. If you see one of your friends doing something risky or something that flouts pandemic rules or regulations or advice on TikTok, let's say, do you publicly name and shame them? Maybe even up to getting them fired or expelled. Well, these kinds of decisions, whether it's anti-vax memes and platform censorship, or whether it's how we interact with other people, always involve various values. And so the first thing I want my students to do is suspend judgment or their immediate reaction and figure out what are the values that are in conflict here. If there was an intelligent person on the other side from my stance on this issue, what would their best argument be? Not their worst, not their weakest, not the thing I think they might think, but what would their best argument be? And what might motivate this? For instance, they might be against censorship of harmful memes because they care about general rules of free expression and free speech online. So I get my students to feel out the moral ground of the debate, including stuff you might not have thought was there to start with. And then I encourage my students to use some of the moral theories I teach them, things like Kant or things like utilitarianism, to try to have some resolution in these cases. Now, different instructors have different ways of teaching moral reasoning, but the point is the same. Before we rush to judgment and persuasion about what we think is the right answer to do, we have to know what other folks may think and how they may think differently and take those opposing arguments into account. So as you can gather, the thing that works for me is using case studies, but you need the right kind of case studies to ground this sort of effort. So that's why I instituted a new program called the Media Ethics Research Scholars with the Center for Media Engagement approximately 2 years ago. What it does is simple. It recruits sharp undergraduate students from the Moody College of Communication, pairs them with myself or grad students to discuss and propose and research and think out case studies. And then after the course concludes, if the writing they have done is sufficient, things get further polished into free OER case studies that any educator can use. These case studies can be found at the mediaengagement.org website under the Media Ethics dropdown, and they cover areas as diverse as advertising ethics, public relations ethics, journalism ethics, free speech, and even digital ethics. So these case studies are perfect implements for instructors to take and use in class in a planned or spontaneous fashion to encourage students to see there are a variety of stances and values involved in these heated issues in today's society, and that the challenge of finding the right thing to do also involves finding ways to interact and persuade others who don't always agree with you. So case studies are one thing that has really worked for me in teaching ethics and ethical decision-making, and I encourage my fellow educators to look at the resources from the Center for Media Engagement and possibly use some of these case studies as something in their classes.